What about you? When's the last time you chopped wood with an axe?
Goodness.
On your break just now?
No, chop some apples.
All right, cool. And we're back for part 2. For this section, we're going to be talking a little bit about some inspirations. Could be lifelong inspiration, stuff from our childhood, mostly around like the comics and literature space. But I left it pretty loose-ended. I just wanted people to be able to talk about things that, they get really excited about. So rotation for today, we're going to be doing Simon, Lucas, Tyler, myself, and then Chad. And with that being said, Simon, tell us a little bit about. Can you actually pronounce his name?
Yeah, I think it's Zé Burnay. He's Portuguese, and this I've followed him on the internet for years, and I actually have a couple of his books. But this is he's been working on this one comic project called Andromeda for I think like 10 years now, and I wanted to talk about him mostly because he is very much like kind of like me, like an illustrator first, and like doing comics as like a side thing, I think. But and because of that, his comics work is like so illustrated. Like everything he does, like every panel is such an incredible like individual scene. And it's cool you put these two together actually because they, I think if you show the later examples, they're more like slow paced and more focused on sort of scenery and illustration. But those first two you put up, I wanted to bring those up because despite that quality, despite that sort of like, it's not static, but it's very like, very detail heavy, not a lot of motion, kind of slower paced as an image, as a narrative. These two still manage to convey like a certain sense of urgency. Second one especially is like very much like an action scene, but this first one, this like sequence where this character is like trying to like bury this skull in the ground while these guys are coming after him. It's so like this, even with like the very simple panel layout, but it's like symmetrical and it just conveys such a sense of like urgency.
There's no dialogue either, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think all the examples I showed today are completely dialogue free. The comic itself is very light on dialogue. It's here and there, but it's mostly just. It's very surreal, and it's got a kind of like Jodorowsky movie-esque feel to it, where it's just a lot of like bizarre imagery and just like mood and scene setting. Yeah, just like the way, because even though, I'm pointing at the screen, it's like anyone can see what I'm pointing at. Even though the images themselves are static in their. Like they don't look like comic art, right? They look like individual illustrations, and there's nothing like speed lines or any sort of like the usual shortcuts that a comic artist might use to convey motion or action or whatever.
That's a good point.
But it's still it comes across regardless. Just like I love especially in that first one the sort of slow approach of these figures, these pursuing figures, and how it feels like a shot like zooming in or something like that. And then another thing I wanted to mention on the second page here is the way the sort of empty sky it really allows the action to kind of shine through. Like in a lot of comics, you'll see, especially in action panels like this, they'll just leave out the backgrounds altogether because it's not the focus of the image. But here you still have a background, and it still like establishes the scene really well. But it's so minimalist that your eyes still brought to the foreground in the action of the figures.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it was our first panel. Jerry goes by Wormwalk. He pulled up Jeff Darrow as like an example, and like I kind of see a little bit of that, especially on that right panel, just with like it being very line heavy and not as much shadows. In the other examples, there's a lot more shadows and stuff. But I think
the first or the second image here was that's like from the very beginning of the book, and I think it is it's something he did over a very long time. So I think it is still like an earlier version of his style. Because as it goes on, it gets a little denser and more detail heavy. And I think his inking style changes a little bit too. But yeah, I really like that sort of very. There's like a lot of detail, but it's like not overwhelming.
And he's kind of like an underground comic. Like he's not like a really big name in the scene.
No, yeah, he's both people. Well, I guess the other guy I'm going to talk about today is a little more established in the industry. But yeah, this guy, I think he self-published all of his comics, and he does a lot of like illustration work and that sort of thing. He might be better known in Portugal or like in Europe, but
Hmm. And do you personally own a couple of his like comics?
yeah, he did the like a published like a hardback of like it's a big collection, and then he also did another story in the same setting with the same characters that's in like an anthology of like indie like dark fantasy comics.
Would you say
So
like
what's
his? Oh, I'm sorry.
no,
Just
go
one
ahead.
quick thing. I was curious, like, would you see his storytelling as a big influence on you, or more of the art style? Like, which of the two?
Mostly the art style. I think you'll especially see the later examples. Like what he does with ink is kind of like where I want to be eventually. Like it's definitely a goal of mine to just have that level of like the management of the lights and darks and the detail, and also like there's still like a little bit of a comic book style to it. Like his faces have a certain like they're not photorealistic. They have a sort of certain like comic book expressiveness to them, which I think is really cool.
Hmm.
But just the quality of the ink work, and again like having that density of detail without it becoming too overwhelming to the eye, which is something that I kind of struggle with sometimes, is conservation of detail.
I was going to say what's kind of interesting about his approach to doing like comic book kind of panel design a little bit, and you know, like Simon, you kind of talk about how his approach is kind of like illustrative, like illustrator style. It also strikes me as like kind of photographic too. Like if you've ever had a couple of like experimental zines before where like it was a comic book but it was composed entirely of still photographs rather than like artwork,
Yeah,
and it has the same kind of quality where it's like the storytelling it can't quite be cinematic in the way that a comic book can, so it feels more like an interesting, like almost like still photograph series of images that they work a little differently. Like the theatricality is a little different than sometimes the cinematic quality that like some comic book artists might kind of pursue. So I find that kind of interesting. It's one of the things that kind of grabs me about it is the way even though he's got a very specific mark making style and illustrative style, it calls to mind to me like almost like a feeling of looking at a series of black and white photographs, you know?
yeah,
It's a
that's a
very
really good
different
point.
way of
I
thinking
think,
about. It's a very different way of thinking about how to set up like sequential art. You know?
yeah, yeah, definitely. And then in some of the later examples too, you can definitely see that where it's the focus is on like sort of big individual moments rather than the flow of action from panel to panel, and your brain just kind of fills in the gaps, and it's not as yeah, it doesn't I guess it doesn't flow in the way that a lot of modern comics do. It's and I think it contributes to a sense of very sort of slow, contemplative storytelling throughout the whole thing. Because again, it's a very surreal, very moody story that isn't super worried about like character dialogue or action happening on every panel or whatever. It's mostly just about this guy sort of traversing these weird, surreal landscapes and encountering strange creatures and stuff. And yeah, it really it gives the images a sense of, or it gives the reader a chance to really take everything in because it's not forcing the eye onto the next panel constantly.
Right. It's like it's kind of atmospheric, right, and emotive
Definitely.
rather than like action narrative oriented.
This one on the left here, is that it's kind of smaller on my phone, but that face down in the bottom right corner, is that its own little like panel within that
That's
panel?
like an inset panel, yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. I was like staring at it for a little bit, and I was like, that is tripping me out. I was like, is there a head and just some bushes, or? And then I started to make out a frame on it a little bit, and I was like, damn, that's such a cool idea. Um, yeah, I can really like personally appreciate somebody who I'm sure in some way they're influenced by, modern comic art, but I like how different it looks compared to what you would, assume you would find in a comic, with how the art style is. I like when people, almost from like the outside world come into it and kind of do their own thing with comics. Cause, I feel like big companies probably get stuck on like house styles and like certain looks. And, you have to keep like certain characters looking the same way over a long period of time, and there's probably not too much, like fluctuation of style, from person to person. And I don't know. I like how these look very different from what you'd expect to find in a comic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, and I love that like right panel as well. That lighting source on that bottom
So
is,
cool.
is super cool. And and that half of that background just being like just pretty dark. Yeah, that's super cool.
Sweet. All right, Lucas.
So so this is an artist I was looking a lot at when I think I started looking at her work when I was in graduate school, but it might have been before. So I'm not sure how to pronounce her name exactly. I think it's pronounced Beta Burgoyne, but I'm not sure at all. I've never heard anyone say her name out loud. And so for quite a while, she was doing these pieces that are just basically like white color pencil on black paper. There's some other pieces that are in color. There's some more recent work that I found of hers that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But so this stuff, I mean, I wanted to kind of do something a little different for my part because I spent, like 6-7 years, studying to be a studio artist and not an illustrator. This was more something that kind of happened, like me kind of falling into the illustration work kind of happened in spite of my best laid plans. And so I spent a lot of time looking at artists, and I kind of want to talk a little bit how that stuff has come over into my illustration work, how I've had to kind of carry over like a different skill set to being an illustrator. And so her work was one that I was just really captivated by at the time that I was looking at it. Her sense of like texture, the sort of atmosphere she can evoke with these really, really deep black backgrounds. It's really just the paper. They're just really, really incredible, evocative. They're semi-abstract, but they have such a cool tech quality to them that I just find them really, really hypnotic to look at. Some people find them kind of dark and morbid, and I don't know if I see that quite, but yeah, an artist that I spent a lot of time looking at, especially when I was a graduate student.
And with that in mind, this is some of your work, right?
Yeah, so I think this stuff would make a little bit more sense too when we look at some of the paintings I was doing. But the idea that texture is something that I was really, really interested in kind of comes over into some of these. I was making a lot of these really small drawings alongside the paintings I was doing when I was in school. And so these will make sense as like isolated fragments kind of pulled out of paintings and then done as these kind of very literalized ink drawings. So one of the things that we're not going to talk about too much today, but I was also really influenced by like scientific illustrations, particularly scientific illustration of like the 19th century, around the time that science became kind of formalized as like an academic profession in like the academy. Like you could actually become a scientist and that be the name of your job. Everybody had to know how to draw then. And so there's this sense that like when something is illustrated in that kind of way, it kind of makes it like legitimates it as a piece of scientific knowledge or something. But I was really interested just in how like taking paintings and then reinterpreting something I was painting and turning it into a drawing kind of worked. Taking little pieces, but someone like Beta Burgoyne, her work was one of those like texture influences I was looking at to kind of make some of these little, they're almost like landscapes seen from the top. They're almost like topographical landscapes, except they could be microscopic. They could be massive. It's hard to tell like what scale you're seeing them on. That's kind of deliberate. I don't know. I don't have too much else to say about these. So they kind of are in dialogue with the paintings I was making a bit more. Yeah, you can see some of it here. So the piece on the top left is one of Beta Burgoyne's like more recent color pieces. All the others are paintings that I was doing in grad school. So, Lee, to your question about cradling, so the picture on the bottom left, the install shot of that painting, yep. that wooden side on it, that's the cradle. That's how it mounts to the wall.
So you're painting on the side of the cradle for the one on the bottom left. and explain why you were doing that?
I don't know. I just wanted the fact that I was using like the museum sized cradles, which is like they're like 2 inches thick. I kind of wanted to bring the objecthood of the painting like more into like the space of the viewer. So instead of just looking at it as a flat surface, you had to kind of like turn your head and like look around it. And you could see kind of more of it. I'm not 100% sure why I was doing that. This is stuff that I was actually doing just after I got out of grad school. So I never really had to talk about it. I just wanted to try it to see if it would work, like as a thing, as a move. And I thought it was pretty cool, but it's really, really time consuming to take these panels, to tape off the sides, to gesso them, sand them, gesso them, sand them, gesso them, sand them, then paint on them successive layers, clear coat them, and then finally at the very end take that tape off and see if those edges came out crisp, because you just really don't know what you're going to get with the tape. With oil paint and tape, you don't know what you're going to get until you finally pull that tape off. And that's kind of actually what's going on in a lot of the actual paintings. So any of the really hard edge, like straight line stuff, that's all taped off and then painted, and then the tape is pulled up and you get those really, really nice straight edges and those kind of polygon shapes. Just another like technique that you can do with oil paint that can be really satisfying looking. It looks really digital. It's not done digital. It's all done by hand.
And like with these pieces, it was like, hung up in like a gallery and stuff. Did you have like little cards that kind of explained what people were seeing, or you just literally had the title and everyone interpreted on their own?
Yeah, I mean, we always like in a gallery situation, you usually have to have an artist statement of some kind. So there would be a statement kind of explaining, not really explaining what people are seeing, but just kind of giving people the rationale for why I was making images like this. So I can kind of talk about it a little bit. It's been quite a few years since I've had to talk about this stuff, but by the time I got out of grad school, I was really interested in climate change and how our understanding of climate change comes from this massive network of remote sensing machines, basically. These machines that sort of extend our perceptual apparatus so we can sense things we couldn't normally sense. So like satellite networks and different kinds of scientific equipment that would be used to test like water quality, things like LiDAR scanning of terrain, and things that would map flows of specific elements. So like there were, like satellites that would map movements of carbon, movements of nitrogen, things like that. And I was really interested in like data visualization too, which is like how they'll take a whole bunch of info and like visualize it in 3 dimensions in a computer. So I was like combining all this stuff together and thinking, well, like all of this is basically like a non-human form of vision. And like, what does it mean then to see like a non-human, particularly like a machine? Like, what would it be like to see like that? And so I started kind of pulling together all these different references. And the idea is that this is like how a machine is like seeing like a big vast like network is seeing climate change, or is seeing the planet Earth in real time, like at all different scales all at once, like microscopic scale, vast like climatological scale. It's also like modeling data all at the same time that it's bringing data in. So I wanted to layer, like collage wise, I wanted to layer all these different ways of seeing and sensing all on top of each other. So the idea that there's like this intense profusion and there's not really any one place to look is sort of intended to kind of mimic like the huge amount of data, but also like a completely unhuman way of like sensing or experiencing the world. It's very like abstract and kind of speculative, but that's kind of what I was trying to do at that time. And so a lot of the techniques I kind of figured out in painting were stuff I had to bring over to illustration when I started working as an illustrator. But you can see like the visual language is like the approach is like really different, right? I had to figure out how to adapt what I've learned as a graduate student, because you can't do something for like 6 or 7 years and then just dump it and say, oh no, I'm an illustrator now, so I have to only have illustrator like skills. It's like, no, I have a lot of skills as a painter from being a studio artist, and I'm going to figure out how to make those work for being an illustrator.
Really interesting, man. Anybody got any comments or questions?
I love that concept. Just for these paintings, the idea of gathering all that data together and like trying to figure out how a machine would process that. It's really cool, and it definitely like I always like with abstract pieces like getting like a little bit of the artist's intent behind it because you get a better sense of like things start to pop out and you start to like kind of see what the idea is, and it's not like when it's not like fully up to interpretation, because like now I'm looking at this and I'm just like, oh yeah, I can get the sense like this overwhelming like ecological data coming in from all sides on like different scales, and it's really cool.
Yeah, I agree. Like once I kind of understood the concept, I see it differently too.
Yeah,
If you
right.
look at like this, I mean, this you can definitely see the parallels with what you're creating now. You know what I mean, with like all the textures and stuff. But when it's like presented in painting and color, I think I see one example. That's why I pulled this here with your universally estranged cover. Like that to me is like somewhat similar. It's like a fusion of illustrative style and kind of what you were exploring here, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean that's what kind of was going on with that piece. Like, the client for that wanted something more abstract, and like I was like, well, I can just like harken back to what I was doing in graduate school as the mode of abstraction I can use, but something very, very different where it's like it's much more biological and kind of cosmological, but I could use the same visual approach. So that's what I did for that album cover, which was like kind of harkening back to a mode that I was familiar with working in to try to do, something a little less like he didn't want the image to be narrative. And I kind of agreed. I didn't think having a narrative image would really make sense for what he was trying to do with the concept in that album. So, I just adapted an approach that I was already used to using, like this sort of visual collage of like layering different scales and different, parts of an image together. It's a little bit less deliberately confusing than the other images because it still has to work as an illustration, but it uses the same style.
Oh, really cool. I guess while we're here too, so the other two images are by Vernon Fisher.
Yeah,
this stuff was
Vernon
pretty.
His stuff is crazy. So this is another guy. He passed away recently. This is like stuff from later in his career. He was making this kind of work in his 70s. Like, it goes to show, like, if you keep it up, like, you can get to some pretty crazy places as a painter. So these are all oil paintings. They're all oil paint. He did this series that was meant to look like chalkboards, and so there's like the chalkboard smears in there. There's these like kind of chalkboard drawings. They're usually overlaid with like different forms of like scientific like graphical presentation. So the one has got like a constellation map. I don't know exactly what the other one is. It's some kind of grid, but you look closely at some of his paintings and he'll have bits in there that are like, they look like pixelated images from like an old like camera or something like that. They're like look like they're all done by hand. I've seen his paintings in person. No fucking clue how he does them. There's got to be some kind of stencil work involved, but it's still all oil paint. It's like incredibly like detailed, like
intentional.
The working methodology is completely insane. But yeah, he was another one where he's like layering different kinds of visual approaches. He's doing a number of different styles all in one piece, and it all like works. It's cohesive. Partly like this series is cohesive because of the chalkboard kind of background, but they're just like an incredibly wide range of visual approaches and like different kinds of scales and things like that he's using in a single painting. It's just kind of mind blowing to see someone doing that sort of thing, and it all basically be done in paint. Like it's not done in any other medium.
Yeah, I bet that would be really cool to see in person.
They're really rewarding to look at if you actually see one. There's one hanging up in the office of a Zig gallery in Chicago that you can walk into their office. It's always open, like when the gallery is open, so you can walk in and take a look at their Vernon Fisher. And they're like big. It's like probably 3 by 4 feet. It's like a landscape orientation. So it's like you can walk up, get your nose like really close to it, and just see like, holy hell, I have no idea how he did this. Even being able to see it up close, I could see that it's oil paint. I could see that it's paint, but I have no idea how he is achieving some of these effects with just paint.
Very cool.
Yeah, I want to
Gives
look
us
at
all
it.
hope.
I want to look at it close.
When we're in our 70s.
Anybody else got anything?
The first artist we talked about with these. What did you say the medium was on those? Is that
These are just white color pencil on black paper.
yeah? Those especially were really cool to look at. I'm gonna have to get the name of that artist for sure and do a little deep dive of that. Yeah, those are so wild.
What about that second one? The colored one. That on the corner there. What do you know? What medium that is?
I do not. Actually, like I said, this is more recent work of hers. I had not seen this stuff before, so I'm gonna guess. If I had to take a guess, I would say she might be actually working in color pencil still.
Oh my god!
And maybe it's on like a tone, like a green paper or something. But I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look it up. I just found that and was like, oh, I hadn't seen this stuff before. I'll pull it. It looks cool.
Yeah, it looks like a petri dish.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like a very
The way it goes into soft focus at the edges is pretty crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, the fuzz on the edge is nuts.
Sweet. All right, Tyler, you're up.
Ooh, Fabian. All right. Yeah, I picked him. Well, aside from just being like a big inspiration, I don't think many people talk about him too terribly much. Like, and I feel like maybe hopefully this can introduce some people to his work. Yeah, and Steven's got an interesting story too. He didn't really become an illustrator until like midlife, which is pretty interesting. He worked in electronics in like the aerospace industry up in Vermont. In like I think the mid '60s, he started illustrating like part time for a couple of publications, but nothing too heavy. And then he got laid off in the mid '70s when he was in his mid 40s, and then decided to focus art, full time, which is very interesting. So I think like a story like that in general is cool for people to hear, that you don't necessarily have to maybe feel like you're, like losing at life because you haven't accomplished like maybe a certain goal by a certain age, like I feel very fortunate myself that I was able to like make an art career for myself, like in my, like 20s and stuff like that on up. But, like, I mean, he started like trying to be an artist, in his mid 40s and like really rose like, to like quite a good fame, I think, like pretty quickly. It seemed like from what I've read, like in the 70s, like everybody was just like beating on his door to get an illustration from him. And I mean, and again, to like see the work that he was able to produce and knowing that he wasn't necessarily drawing as a child or even as an early adult, from what I've read, like it's pretty nuts, like what he pulled off just by being inspired by the things that he was inspired by and being like, oh, I'm going to do art now, and just really like putting in the work and the effort, to do stuff like that. But, again, it's like, the things that he did they're a little different from like the techniques that I maybe use more often, but I've started, recently dipping into that like stipple paper style stuff, going back to like some pencils and mixing it with some ink, which is what he primarily worked on. And yeah, it's just like he just got it all there, like there's dramatic lighting, like great contrast, the compositions are like very pleasing to look at. I mean, subject matter wise, like, horror, fantasy, there's a few sci-fi like pieces as well, I think I pulled. Yeah, I mean, he's just like, it's kind of crazy looking into his backstory that he wasn't doing art for a long period of time before he started making these. But yeah, I think that kind of adds to the impressiveness of the pieces too. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nuts, but but yeah, that's.
Do you have a couple
Fabian.
of do you have a couple of books by him as well? Because I just bought 2 this week when I saw these.
So aside from like a couple of books that have just some illustrations from him in them, the ones that the
Fantasy by Fabian.
Yeah, Fantasy by Fabian, and then more Fantasy by Fabian. And they put these out in the 70s too, so he was still like very early on in his career. But yeah, just so you can kind of like check those out. I'm
So
sure
the audience, those are about like $60 to $80 books.
Yeah, yeah, and it even says in like the openings of the book, like Stephen has only been working like professionally when those were put out for maybe like a handful of years, like 4 or 5 years. But I mean, like that's a massive amount of illustrations to like pull from just like the mid to late 60s to like the late 70s, and it's all impressive stuff, and there's everything in there, from like heavy like fantasy inspired stuff, like nude illustrations, all kinds of things. But yeah, I think most of it is primarily that like ink and pencil on the stipple paper. There looks like there's a few things in there that are like maybe like ink washes. And he's also a really good painter too.
Yep.
There, you can find a few of his like color paintings floating around as well on the internet. But yeah, I mean, I always kind of gravitated towards the black and white stuff, especially. But yeah, I just think the backstory on him in general, like starting, midlife and deciding like I'm going to be an artist now, and just like really just knocking it out of the park quick, like I think he was up for like several awards there for like years in a row for like, like like sci-fi artist of the year or whatever, fantasy illustrator of the year, like that kind of stuff. Like that's awesome to like be so new into art and like already kind of have that like fame to the name. So but
is he American?
Yeah, he is. He was I think he lived in New Jersey, moved to Vermont, and then moved back to New Jersey after that. So yeah, and he's like, as far as I know, I think he's still living. I believe he's in his 90s right now, but
wow.
I don't think that he's passed away yet, which is cool, because again, like most of those guys that I feel like a lot of us draw inspiration from have unfortunately passed on. So it's cool to know that, like, I mean, he's still around.
There's I was just gonna say there's one book out there that is much cheaper than those ones you just showed. I bought it online, and then I literally went to this bookstore that I went to. It was $8, and it has both of these pieces. It doesn't have those ones on the other. It has the spider piece. But yeah, you can get that one. It's called I think it's like Ladies in Fantasy. It was published in the 90s. You can get that book for under 20 for anyone, panelists or anybody in the audience. Like, because things like this are good, older works to kind of like study and learn from.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, that would be more than worth it to pick up that kind of book. Yeah, and I've been lucky enough to like find a few other things that have his work in it too. Like I have behind me on the shelf, there's like a stack of old zines from like the 80s and 90s that have some work from him in it, called Weird Book, and yeah, some other like yeah, there's a few other like Fabian things behind me, but yeah, again, just in general, like the work pretty much speaks for itself. I mean, it's like everything that I love about black and white illustration, like, I mean, the borders are impressive too. Like them in itself, like seem like little works of art, framing, and, just as cool, like work of art. So yeah, it's just fun stuff to sit and look at, just like Finlay, who, was like a big inspiration to him as well. So, you can see it in the work, but yeah, it's just good stuff.
What you got, Lucas?
Oh, I was just agreeing. I was just saying it's cool.
But yeah, do you have any other comments on these pieces?
No, I think that I was agreeing with Tyler. The border work on those first 2 pieces is fantastic.
Yeah,
I'm just looking at those, being like, man, oof.
Yeah,
just
hand drawing
gets your juices flowing. Like makes you.
Yeah.
It's like makes me like, man, I really want to draw now. Shoot, I want to go sit down and draw.
Oh, totally. Yeah, like looking at his books and like Virgil's work as well. That's exactly the type of stuff that I like to do. If I just need to like get in the mood to draw, which isn't like hard to get me to sit down and draw. But yeah, if you want like an extra boost of just like, man, let's go get to work, like, that work is perfect. So
Simon, Chad, you guys got anything?
Yeah, this guy totally passed me by. I've never heard of him, and
Mhm.
I go out of my way searching for stuff, and this is amazing. I'm definitely checking them out now. It's just Fabian,
Stephen
yeah,
Fabian.
Stephen Fabian.
Stephen Fabian. Okay.
Yeah, he was yeah, like I was saying before, he had a few things like that were published while he was still working in the 60s, but yeah, he really didn't start like I think cranking out like full-time art until the 70s when he was in his mid 40s, which again is just
That's
that's
what I
awesome.
did.
There was a cool piece. Okay, so one note, his his website, I think it's just stephenfabian.com, has like it's like the gallery on there is like I think it said it was like 500 plus images that you can go
Oh my
through.
god.
And what's cool about them is they have like like a comment along with each piece of art. Like if you click on it, he'll kind of give like a little backstory to things. And there was one that's like pretty early on in the gallery of I think I'm blanking on the name of it, but either way, it was his little like dive into that story where he went to work one day, found out his whole department was getting cut off because of there was like an oil like what do you want to call it like I don't know if it
Spill?
It's
well
like the
it was
oil
like
embargo
something
of
to
the
do with
70s, right? There was
I
that
think it
oil
had
embargo
something
in
to
the
do with like
70s.
maybe like more of a like they basically it cut off work here in the states, like it made it tough for them to do whatever they
Okay.
needed to do in the aerospace industry, so he got laid off and then was driving home angry and upset and said he got home and had two letters waiting for him for like publishers wanting his work, and he was like, all right, I'm doing this. And he
Hell
just
yeah.
said ever and he
Good
said from that
choice.
point on he never had to look back, and he just said he always had a steady flow of people wanting his work from then on, which is, yeah, I mean, how awesome is that? You like look at this one instance in your life where you think like, oh, like great, this is where my life goes completely downhill, and then you get home and it's like your life changes for the better and you get to do what you love for a living. So yeah, I just think it's a cool story for him.
Sick. All right, my turn. So big name in comics, but I have multiple sources of inspiration from Todd McFarlane, and he's kind of a love him or hate him type of guy, both his art and his personality. Um, but for me, like growing up in the '90s, like that '90s comic style. I mean, I don't know if I'd say it's like the biggest influence on my own work, but I always was really intrigued by it. And I think with Todd specifically, like there's a couple touch points that stick with me. So Todd is a person. First of all, he's a character, right? So he does a ton of interviews, and he'll interview with like channels that are like my size, and this guy holds records for the most comics sold ever. So there's like he's kind of like very confident, yet he also is a fan first type of person. So I'll kind of start with like the personality and like his story. So he grew up in kind of like blue collar type of house. Sports was like the main thing. He didn't find art until he got a baseball injury and he was about like 16, 17 or 18. And that's when he first got into comics and started drawing. And basically from then on, he was just drawing all the time and trying to get as good as possible. And he's Canadian. And at the time, there wasn't like, everything was New York in terms of like Marvel and DC. But what he was doing was just trying to get better, drawing, doing as much as he can. But what I admire about him is like his kind of tenacity and, he has a ton of perseverance and he gets a lot of rejection. So he gets about 300 rejection letters from all the submissions that he did to Marvel and DC. And he like kept all of them. He wrote down all of, like the editors, was like mailing it to each one specifically. Like he was thinking like a business person or like a salesperson, but he was also an artist. And that like dichotomy of being both a business person and an artist is something that I can relate to a lot because that's kind of what I do outside of work or outside of work with the channel, of course. So like I just listen to his interviews like all the time, and he pumps me up. And I've heard his story like 6, 7, 8 times. But he has like at least 30 interviews on YouTube. And when I want to just get inspired to get fired up, he just has that kind of like energy. And it translates into his work too. I mean, he had a very unique style at the time, and it shook things up a lot, and kids liked it. That's why he sold so much. And he set records for, the highest selling Spider-Man at the time. Now, he did get the benefit of the speculator market. So a lot of people are just buying, think that they could make profit later. But his art resonated with people who didn't want to see the stuff that was produced in the 70s, which I love, but at that time that wasn't the zeitgeist. So I just love the energy, there's a lot of lines, but there's a lot of like each line is like really dynamic. You can tell that he has like a snap to it. And while it is like in some ways highly rendered, in other ways it's kind of loose too. So him as a person, as well as his art, has kind of always stuck with me. I also recall, first seeing Spawn, the design of the character, and the Spawn like toys, and a Toys R Us when I was like 8, and it was like one of those things where it's like, oh, I'm not supposed to like this, so I immediately got really intrigued. So he kind of brought that like dark aesthetic to the mainstream kids. That kind of got me fueled up and really, really intrigued. So I'm not like reading comics all the time, especially superhero comics, but his art style and his nimbleness with the pencil and pen, and like somewhat disregard for anatomy, but then also like forcing stuff, has always just been really pleasing to the eye. His sense of flow. I could kind of go on, but he's somebody that I look up to a lot. I don't know if you guys have any takes and if you love him or hate him.
Oh, I love him. So I was a teenager when he came out. It was like him, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee,
Yeah.
and a couple others. So it was mind blowing when his stuff came out. It was like there was nothing like that. Now people talk shit on it, but back then, no, it was amazing. Like I copied his drawings all the time or his comic panels. He was
Yeah.
definitely influential.
Yeah, I
And
think
like he
he
still
really
draws capes better than anyone, in my opinion. I love how he
Yeah,
draws
they're
his
giant.
capes. Yeah.
The biggest capes ever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
him, and I also really like Kelly Jones's capes as well. Like
Oh, Kelly Jones, yeah.
yeah, I love his Instagram so much. But it's so funny that you picked Todd, because I was almost about to pick him as like a comic influence and stuff, and kind of went a little different direction. But yeah, I would honestly like agree to everything that you said about it, because you and I are about the same age as well.
Yeah.
Man, like late '90s, early 2000s, like Spawn stuff was. I mean, I don't know if I have them around here that I can think of, but I mean, all of my old sketchbooks are literally just like Spawn. It's everywhere in my old sketchbooks. Like there are so many like start and stop sketches of Spawn. Yeah. I mean, same. That was like a big like turning point, I think, in like art and like my childhood inspirations for for art. Because yeah, I mean, like I think like early like childhood book illustration, like up to that point was like pretty big for me, and then all of a sudden, here comes Spawn and comics, and I was just like, oh my god, like this is amazing. Like convincing my mom to drive me out like every quarter to get the new Spawn issue and stuff like that, and then of course the movies and the toys, and yeah, I mean that stuff was like huge for me as a kid. So yeah, I'm glad that you picked Todd, because I would agree. Like art style, and then also just the drive to continue to pursue something even with all the rejection up front, and just
Yeah.
like turning it around and being like one of the biggest selling comics in history. That's just like, that's nuts. So yeah, good choice.
Oh, thanks, man.
I haven't read a lot of his stuff personally, but I do know a fair amount about him just as like a figure in comics, and I do really respect the way he kind of shook everything up in the '90s at a time when it seems like it really needed to happen, where like mainstream comics were just really kind of dead ending in a lot of ways, and just kind of bringing this sort of fresh energy to it was like especially like his style just exemplifies like '90s superhero
Oh yeah.
comics to me. Like it's such an iconic look, and
Well,
yeah, and also I guess he founded Image Comics too, or co-founded it, and that was they're still going strong today, and they put out some of the best like creator-owned comic books out there. Like
Yeah.
all the comics I really like to read are usually published by Image. So,
Saga, Walking Dead,
yeah,
Invincible. Yeah, I mean
so
those are
many,
the
like, so
big
much
sellers.
yeah.
so much cool
Yeah, I
stuff.
think Spawn first really hit when I was in junior high, and so the toys didn't really come out till maybe I was almost out of high school, I want to say. But that's one of the things that's kind of striking about it. I mean, I was really into. I was like, just the same. I was like really into Spawn. Actually, one of my favorite comic books of all time is actually the Spawn Batman crossover. I want to say it was the Image Comics version of it. It's just a fucking cool comic. But what's interesting too is like he almost did kind of took like the George Lucas playbook a lot farther. Like instead of like licensing the Spawn shit, he's like, I'm gonna make my own fucking toys. I'm not gonna license it to Mattel or something. I'm gonna start my own toy company, which was kind of smart. I mean, like he didn't have to. He got to make the toys that he wanted to make, which he wouldn't have gotten to if he'd have licensed it out to some company to do. They would have just done, some shitty action figure. So I mean, he's kind of also like maybe under. We haven't really touched on like his kind of business instincts has been really, really good.
Oh yeah.
To do that,
He was always ahead of the curve,
Yeah, but I'm
man.
not having all my Bluetooth.
yeah, just because I had a shit ton of Spawn toys for quite a while. I had a shit ton of them. And, like I was like a fucking adult at that point. Like, I just was like, these are super cool. These are what I would wanted to have when I was a kid. So yeah, oh yeah, I want those. Yeah. I mean, honestly, he's probably specifically like responsible for things like NECA and some of the other toy companies that came after.
Well, the adult toy market,
yeah, they probably only exist because of McFarlane Toys. You know what I mean? Like that creating the adult toy market and like really, really high quality action figures. Like I don't think that would have existed without McFarlane Toys. So like really revolutionary on the whole business.
he also like so how he got into sports figures and stuff was interesting. So no one was taking him seriously when he was going like to NFL and MLB and stuff, and was like, "Hey, I'll make a really nice figure like of you, and like people will buy it, just like they buy baseball cards, right?" So no one was taking him seriously. So what he did was he basically bid and won the bid on the Mark McGwire like home run balls. I think he paid like $3 million for him, and he got all this like press because like, who the hell is this guy who's paying $3 million for a ball? And then from that, they're like, all right, this guy must have money. So then that decision basically bankrupted him. But then he got the licenses to basically do like some sports figures, and that opened up the market even more. So like, I don't know, man, because I love reading about business, like Wall Street Journal, business biographies, like that kind of shit's really interesting to me. So like he has that intersection of being an artist, but also a business person, which, there's a lot of shitty business people out there, a lot of bad ethics and stuff like that. But for him, I think he has those ethics in check because it's still always produce the best product and be a fan first type of person. Like something that he brags about is being able to hold his bladder for hours and hours on end, so that when there's a line for signatures for comic signings and stuff, he doesn't have to go up to like, imagine you're waiting in line for 2 hours. You finally get up to him and he's like, oh no, I got to take a lunch break. It'll be an hour more. He doesn't want to ever do that. So he'll hold his bladder all day just to sign for everybody. It's like, who the hell does that? So like, dude, I'm telling you, anybody who's watching this, I mean, finish the episode, but like Todd McFarlane's interviews are like legendary because he's just like this. He's like this character you don't get nowadays, like he is like a salesperson, but it's like highly interesting. I love his vibe. He's a character. I could talk about him all day though. I have like his book, and like I've said, I know his story inside and out, because if I'm ever feeling like not inspired, it's like my go-to. I'll rewatch him. So it's like my self-help book, basically. All right, let's keep going. All right, so we got some assorted covers here from you, Chad.
Yes. So the first one's San Julian, and he's one of the Spanish. I don't know. They all did the creepy, eerie Vampirella. It's all there. It's all Spanish for a long time. So he's an oil painter, and just I don't know. I love it. It's just you can tell it's really simple. It's just blue oil, then a black, the shading and all that, and just a simple, very simple. Some whites and stuff on top of that. But those Spanish guys from the 70s were just amazing, and they would take a lot of things like scenes and put it into their paintings. So I really enjoy those. And the middle one, that's Ken Barr. He was a Scottish artist, and he did a lot of like Marvel, a lot of Hulk. So Marvel in the 70s, they used to have the magazines, not comic books, but magazines, maybe a little more adult. And I believe even that Sherlock Holmes is a Marvel. So again, it's very simple. It's just blue. He painted blue. He did all the black, and then he put all the color in the dog, the Hounds of Baskerville. So the glowing.
I think that one kind of cracks me up, but like I love it. There's some kind of humorous to me about that dog, dude.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I like love it.
Toxic dog. It has always caught my eye for whatever reason. It's super simple and trashy, but I love it. And then the third one, Vincente I think down here, Segreles. So he would do whole comic books, like this comic book series called Mercenary, and he oil painted every single panel. Like, it's really awesome. You should check it out. The Mercenary is really cheap too. They're like, I don't know how many editions there are, but they're real thin. There's like 36 pages each one, but it's all oil painted, every single frame. And he would do the covers too, like this one. It's an oil painting. And I love it how you can see the canvas at the bottom. They just left it. He didn't even fill it in. It's just canvas, and he painted those characters on top. So even though Ken Barr is not Spanish, the Spanish stuff is my number one influence. Enrique Torres, Esteban Morano, all those eerie, creepy Vampirella. And my parents let me buy when I was a little kid because they were only like $1. They were already cheap when I was a kid. I wasn't a kid in the 70s, but they were cheap. So just seeing all that stuff. I had them all hanging on my wall. Wish I didn't get rid of them.
Nice, man.
Yeah, it's just amazing how like little you can get away with sometimes, right? To like convince a viewer of something you want to convince them of. Like how little you need to do sometimes to sell an image. It's like Chad is saying, like that one on the left, it's a blue wash basically, or a blue ground. And there's like, I mean, yeah, there's like some nuance in that value work. Definitely. There's some darker values and some lighter values. There's quite a wide value scale going on. But like you say, there's not like a lot when you look at any one part of it. There's not like a lot. It's like, it's kept really, really fresh. Just like quick moves of the brush and then just move on to the next thing. And yet it's completely convincing as an image, right? It's not, there's nothing like, it doesn't feel incomplete in any way, right? It feels like feels completely finished. It's just amazing, like people who have that. I mean, my instinct is always just to overdo everything. So when I see artists that have a lot more restraint and are able to use that restraint more efficiently, it's like, it just blows my mind a little bit.
It has a very Frazetta quality to it, with the sort of vague background, but just the really dramatic lighting and the way it focuses everything on the figures, and how so much detail is implied without actually being rendered.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, he knows how to put in just enough, right? Just enough, not too much, not too little, just enough.
Great choices. I really like that Psycho cover too. Also with how they curved like all of the lettering to kind of like, match the curve of that cloak or drape or whatever around the image. Yeah, that cover in general is just such a cool cover. there was an Instagram. I'm blanking on the name, but they were doing. They had like a run of it was just like Psycho like mag covers like for like every day. It was just a new cover art, and I was like, man, this is the greatest week on Instagram. They were so good. But yeah, I agree, man. Those Spanish guys that had a run there on those covers in Creepy and Eerie are just like insane. Yeah.
Yeah, check out the Mercenary books.
Nice.
They're amazing.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look into those. Yeah. Yeah, great picks.
When you say mercenary books, so where it says like the title, like Eerie and Psycho, is that
No,
it says
it's
mercenary? Or?
it's separate. I think it would have been maybe on Metal Hurlock back in the day, but
Okay.
they put it in books, and it's just called Mercenary. And it's like a knight. It flies around on dragons and.
So if I search mercenary comic in eBay, you think I'd find it?
Yeah, I just pulled it up. I found one. They've got. I see volume 1 for $7 on Abe Books.
Abe?
Yeah.
Okay. Simon Roy.
Yeah, another Simon. This is Simon Roy. He's a Canadian artist and writer. He does both, and I think he mostly got like kind of into the industry. His first big thing was actually an adaptation of an old Rob Liefeld character, Prophet, which Image relaunched a few years ago, and he's like, this sort of like spacefaring guy. I think that's him in the second image there in the foreground. But he did a few runs on that, but he's also done loads of independent work, and like he's done a lot of covers and like little short bits for anthologies and that sort of stuff. I bring him up mostly because he's kind of in some ways the opposite of Zé Burnay, who I mentioned earlier, in that like his style is very loose and very it's kind of functional. Like it's not as focused on like explicit rendering, and but again, like there's no loss of detail, and there's no loss of like character. It's all very like it almost looks like a sketch, but it still reads like a finished image. And I especially like how Lee, if you wouldn't mind going back to those other ones, like the mechanical details in the second image here, how even though it's kind of like a loose, sort of sketchy style, it still feels very solid. And I think that's kind of like I have a lot of trouble drawing inorganic shapes, basically, and it's cool to see an artist who can do that without resorting to like using a ruler all the time or like focusing on like hard edges and stuff like that. Like it still reads as robotic and mechanical elements without being too like pristine and sharp, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I wanted to bring up is how I do a lot of fantasy stuff and a lot of like world building and that sort of thing, and I like to try and draw from more obscure references. So I'm not just doing the same kind of like medieval fantasy that. I mean, obviously there's some of that, but it's kind of oversaturated. So I try and find other sources for stuff, and I think Simon Roy is really good at that. Like in the sort of cultural details, I guess, for lack of a better word, in this left image here. Like you can tell he's drawing from like maybe like Aztec imagery. There's like maybe some old like Iron Age Celtic stuff in there, maybe like some Central Asian influence. Like it's all over the place, and I think it creates these characters and these settings that feel much more original than what you might get in sort of the standard like generic sci-fi or fantasy setting. Lee, if you want to go back to those other two for just a second. Like this one on the left here, there's clearly some sort of medieval Renaissance influence there, but you have these strange creatures, and the architecture and some of the details on the costumes are very feel much more outlandish and like less like something that you would see.
It's kind of samurai.
Yeah. There's definitely some like East Asian influence in there. It's all over the place. And that's what I really like about it. Is he does a really good job of blending.
He's got
all
like
these
mission style tile roof in there too, like that you would see in like California or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really, really different.
Like he takes all these disparate elements and combines them into something that feels relatively original. I think that's one of the things I really like about his work.
Do you know where he's from?
I think he's Canadian. I'm pretty sure.
Say it's like a very French. Reminds me of like heavy metal. Or
yeah, Yeah, he definitely. I think, and you can kind of see it in that second image too, like the uncolored one. It reminds me a lot of like of that sort of like Ligne Claire style that the French artists in the 70s and 80s were really into.
I like the. I mean, it might not have been him, but the colorist on the right there with like those kind of like semi muddy greens with the
Yeah.
complementary colors with like those purples and yellows. Like I kind of like it because we were talking about watercolor earlier. Like the approach of how this particular panel was done kind of feels more like watercolor, which I always like when there's that kind of touch in comics where like it doesn't look too digital. So
Yeah,
I like it a lot.
yeah. I think most of this colored stuff I've seen has definitely been digital colors, but they're not. Yeah, they have it. They still have this sort of painterly quality to them, which works really well.
So what do you know what comics these are from then? Are they the same?
So I think they're different. I'm not 100% on the one on the right. The one on the left is for a comic he self-published called Grizz Grobus, and it's like a sort of it's a this panel is from like a sort of inset fantasy story within this sci-fi story of this larger world. The first two, that first one there, that's from an anthology he did. Actually, he shared that anthology with Zé Burnay and one of his shorter Andromeda stories as well.
Oh,
And then the second one, I think, is a pre-color cover image from the Prophet series he did.
sick.
So that was for Image Comics on the right there. So, but he's super prolific. He's done a lot of stuff. He's putting out like a web comic right now, which he's been publishing in volumes, and I think he's been like putting stuff on the internet and working for various publishers for the last like 15-ish years or so. He's about, I think he's in his 30s. He's about our age, but
Really? Oh
yeah.
man, I just felt like shit. No, I'm just kidding.
Tell me about it, right?
I thought he was like in his 50s. All right, cool. I'm gonna start drawing right after this. Sweet. Lucas is not here. There he is.
Yeah, so this is Sean Norvett, who also is an oil painter, kind of another contemporary painter. He's someone who I would kind of put in maybe the same category as someone like Christian Van Minnen, doing these very, very bizarre, like they start off as like portraits. His earlier stuff is very, very specifically kind of portrait style, but he's since kind of continued to sort of abstract that approach. But I mean, I've seen his paintings in person. They're absolutely fucking incredible in person. It's like unbelievable because a lot of them are not even that big. Like they're like maybe this big, and to see like your level of detail he's getting with oil paint is like outstanding. The textural quality, like that he's able to achieve. The different kinds of where some stuff is flat, some stuff is graphic, some stuff is highly rendered and realistic. All these different textures being captured. But like once again, it's like the same thing. It's like this collage aesthetic. So I saw his stuff at Expo Chicago many years ago, and he's shown by Richard Heller Gallery, and so Richard Heller was actually there at that booth, the guy who runs the gallery, and I was like looking at the Sean Norvett because I knew who he was and I knew who the paintings those were his paintings. I was just kind of like marveling at him, and the gallery guy just kind of comes up behind me. He's like, it's basically like, man, because Sean Norvett's a California painter. He's in LA, I think LA based. He's like, it's like if a fucking Valley guy was like made of everything he ever smoked or ate or looked at or listened to, he just showed like everything he'd ever snorted or ingested or whatever, and you just showed it as like the figure. It's like that's what it is. It's like totally Valley paintings. That's Richard Heller is kind of a character, kind of a gallerist. So I definitely could see that. I was like, oh yeah, that's totally what's going on in all of these paintings. It's like showing like everything that kind of would make a particular person, but all the materials that would make that person based on their existence in LA or like outside of LA. So just really, really cool painter, endlessly rewarding to look at his stuff. I would encourage you guys to like take a look. If you ever have a chance to see anything of his in person, they're like beyond, it's like just absolutely mind blowing to see that shit.
It's so cool, man. Although I'm looking at the thing on the left, it's like he has like a nacho chip for an eye, man. Like that's how I interpret it.
Yeah. It's like a loaded nacho. He's
Yeah.
got like a little bag. I just love that the mouth though is just like a cartoon mouth. It's like
Oh yeah.
it's like literally like pulled out of like Beavis and Butthead. You know, it's like
Those
stupid
cartoon
dashes
bulldogs
for
are so
braces.
badass.
Yeah, those tripping dogs.
Yeah. I love this kind of shit. Anybody else got anything on this?
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, just the fact that it comes across almost as a collage when it's all oil paint.
Yeah.
That's just really incredible.
It's like a living collage.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, like a living collage. Nice.
All right, Tyler, Stephen Gamble.
Yeah. So yeah, my second Steven for today. Yeah. I mean,
I'm not gonna be able to sleep tonight now, just so you know.
yeah, I know, and like that's a good reason why I picked this guy. Yeah, I mean, I feel like some of my earliest like inspirations for wanting to do just art in general came from a lot of like children's storybooks and things like that. Like I loved being able to sit down with books as a kid and just kind of like really go through the artwork itself. And what's funny is even like, you know, 30 some years later, these illustrations probably stick out like stronger than any that I ever seen as a kid. And probably some of the most earliest influences for like just dark and weird art that I was, able to like, enjoy and like really like pick apart. And, you know, he just has the perfect mix of, like just that eeriness and like weirdness. And I mean, there's just like, there's so much cool stuff to look at about his art. And what's funny is like, I think majority of his other book art is very colorful. It's very, like, it's not anything quite like this at all. Like as far as what I've been able to find out about Stephen Gamble is, I mean, I think he started book illustration kind of around the same time frame, like 70s and stuff like that. I know his dad was an art editor for a magazine, so I think he was like, influenced pretty early on as a child and very like they definitely promoted his wanting to do art, and which is cool. But yeah, I think a lot of his other illustrations are very colorful. And then then these came along in the 80s and 90s, and everybody's just like, "What the hell is this like nightmare?" And I think those books like called a lot of crap for like just how like morbid and scary the art looked, for that time frame, which is awesome to kind of like leave that behind as a legacy. Like I wish like I could draw something that would disturb people so bad that they're like, I don't know if people should see this shit. But and like you can look on it now and definitely like, like we've probably all seen like more like edgier stuff at this point. But yeah, I mean like for the time that it came in and just like what it looks like, the level of like things rendered to things not rendered at all, just like I don't know. He just did like an insanely good job at what he pulled off with these illustrations, and they're still some of my favorite book illustrations to date for sure. I think it's all pencil as far as I know. He
Be like a different technique to it though, didn't it? Did it involve like shavings or something? I read about it a while ago.
Yeah, and Steven's kind of tricky too because I don't think he's a very interview heavy guy. I don't think he likes to do those, so there wasn't really much I could read on about him at all. But yeah, again, from what I gather, it's just like he had he was definitely like, influenced early on by art his dad would bring home and show him, and, started pursuing illustration. I think he's like started getting like published work around the 70s as well. He was definitely like had the what is it, the Caldecott honor, like that award for illustration and stuff for other books. But yeah, I mean, these I think just I think are probably what people remember him from. It'd be interesting to know if he likes that people remember him for these specifically.
I think
Yeah.
I think he doesn't. I think I read somewhere, I could be wrong, but I think I read somewhere he doesn't, he's not very happy that this is what he's remembered for and not his other
Yeah.
work.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like it's very vastly different from the other stuff that I've seen in the other books.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
the
really
other stuff
different.
is very
I had-
like,
We're just
I had
pouring
no
salt in
idea.
his wound right now.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
no, I had-
but again, like it's like some of the more like iconic book illustrations for me, like the time period that I grew up in, and just like what I'm into visually. I mean, this stuff's perfect. So, um, yeah, yeah, he's probably, I would say, probably one of my earliest art influences for sure. I remember having these in elementary school, and just like checking them out at the library, and I just couldn't get enough of it. So they were actually one of the first books I remember like specifically wanting to buy for my daughter as a child, because we would read her a book every night. And I was like, oh, I'm going to get these, but they're probably more for me than her. But I was like, maybe she would think these are cool. I don't think she's looked at them in who knows how long, but I just love that we still have them in the house. But yeah, they're amazing. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember being like 6 years old or so, and I encountering one of these in the library, and I had to work up the courage over multiple trips to like actually check it out and read it.
Yeah.
It's definitely
Yeah,
like,
I mean, they're terrifying. Yeah,
yeah.
it's so good. Like he just, he nailed it with the aesthetic that he was going for. And, again, like that's funny that he probably doesn't like being well known for this stuff, but because I mean, I think that like whatever he did in this book was, what you do to be remembered, like, well after your lifetime, I think. So I think he's in his, I want to say probably his 80s now, based on when he was born. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think these will be around for a long time. I don't see people getting tired of looking at this.
I wonder if he was working with graphite powder.
That was
You
it.
can,
Powder.
you
Yeah.
can
Oh
work with,
yeah,
you
yeah.
Not
can,
shavings.
you can work
Powder.
with graphite powder in alcohol. If you
Mhm.
put it in
Yeah.
alcohol, you can literally paint it on kind of like paint, but it behaves very differently. But it allows you to like paint it onto a surface with a brush, and then the alcohol immediately evaporates, and you're left with like washes of graphite on things.
Yeah. I used to do a similar thing too when I was doing graphite drawings and stuff. I would do graphite powder, or I would like powder the surface, and then I would spray acetone on it from like just like a spray bottle, and it would just dry the water droplets like in the graphite powder, and you just kind of give it like a gentle like you blow it, and then it just like leaves that like water droplet look within the
Yeah.
powdered area. Yeah, I mean, cool stuff, and I don't doubt that he probably utilized some of that as well. Um, yeah, I mean, it's just so cool. Like, definitely some of my favorite like pencil illustrations for sure.
They're absolute nightmare fuel. I have a vivid memory of being in third grade around Halloween, our teacher reading out of this book to us, and I think it's the story where there's like a dead woman in a basement or something that's like walking
Mhm.
around, and she showed that I couldn't sleep for like weeks. You're seeing that. I had to say like an influence that's like more deeply imprinted in my brain than I'm probably conscious of, sort of thing. It's
Yeah,
like a
yeah. I mean, you
primal
just don't
memory
forget.
of being terrified. I mean, I
Yeah,
remember when these books came out, like they came out when I was in maybe second or third grade, and they didn't really cause a stir other than people thought they were really cool.
yeah,
I think it
yeah,
was only later that people were like, maybe these are too scary for kids.
yeah. I
Um,
I think that there was like a reprinting of them where they took
Yes.
his illustrations out, and people got
yeah,
upset that they weren't in there, so that they put
Because
it back
it,
yeah.
in.
it was
Because
out when
nobody
I was
remembers
a
the
kid.
stories really. It's like the illustrations completely
It's the
overshadow them. So
Oh,
illustrations. Yeah, it is.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that I think that book is solely remembered on the illustrations for sure. I mean, the stories are fun, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like those drawings, like yeah, keep you up at night when you're a kid for sure.
Yes.
What were you gonna say, Chad?
I was saying they came out like in the early 80s, like 81, 82, because we had them at my elementary school, and we used to always check them out when probably like first grade. So they've been out for a long time.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I think the third volume was like that was the only one released in the '90s, but yeah, the other two were I think '81 and '84 were when book one and two came out. So, um, just super cool. Like hard to forget stuff, and again, I think that's kind of what everybody probably strives for as an artist. To like create something that people remember you by, and like, I mean, for me, that's it. For him, but whether he likes it or not, I'm gonna remember him for these. So.
Nice, man. I kept kind of a similar vibe too, with it being from my childhood. So I saw the movie first, and I was a kid, and I actually forgot the name of this movie until recently. And then I saw it, and I was like, "Holy shit!" This thing was like so deeply ingrained in my psyche. So this is from the book on the left, and this was illustrated by Wayne Anderson. And then the movie, I took a little clip there because that was what I really knew when I was a kid. It's called Flight of Dragons.
Oh yeah.
So, dude, like, first of all, I mean, I'm still this way, man. Like, dragons are my favorite thing to draw when I was a kid, teenager, and still now. Like, I love dragons because you can be so creative with them, but they have like enough of a shared mythology that people know what a dragon looks like. So I love the experimental nature of them. And like, there's fat dragons, there's Chinese dragons, there's Japanese dragons, there's English dragons. Like, that's what's so cool about them to me. So the way that Wayne Anderson draws them, I love how like whimsical they are. And also like, the eyes are like really big, and like the claws are like kind of like goofy. Like they have that kind of children's book illustration to them. But like, I just look at this stuff, and like I was talking about earlier, like shapes to me are the most important thing in like my view of art, or what I like try to create. So I look at the strong silhouette of this dragon on the right, and like that's the kind of stuff that I like to try to capture too, like a sense of flow, and you just get sucked into this strong silhouette and the shapes of these, and the colors too, man. Like there's definitely a lot of like soft color transitions between these purples and the yellows and the greens. But kind of talking back to the movie, man, when I watched that as a kid, like the whole like plot, if I remember correctly, was like a balance between like accepting science and math, but then also like not losing sight of magic. And it was like that duality. And I always thought that was interesting. But yeah, I don't know. Chad, you remember this movie?
Oh yeah, it was like Rankin Bass, like the same people that made the Hobbits from whatever the late '70s. So it had that Hobbit look to it. It was awesome.
Yeah,
I loved it.
I don't know. Did anybody else look at this book or this movie?
No, I've never seen this movie, and I'm not familiar with this artist. I am a huge fan of the Rankin Bass Hobbit. I mean, I loved that since I was a kid. Probably watch it several times a year still as an adult. But I've never seen, I'm going to actually track this down because I've never seen the movie, and I'm not familiar with the artist. I really like the work. I'm like, once again, I'm always really drawn to a sense of texture, even if like the way that different media capture different kinds of texture. And I just love like the way the dragon scales are done in this. I love the kind of approach to each part of it. It's like, I don't know if I would quite describe it as being exactly whimsical, but it definitely has a different kind of fantastic vibe that I find really, really compelling.
Yeah.
I would also say that it has a certain similarity to that Rankin Bass Hobbit production, in that there's something about the aesthetic of it where it's like, it is kind of whimsical, but it's also kind of dark at the same time. And there's a really cool like kind of contrast there, where there's something about that era of a certain kind of fantasy art where it had a sort of like brooding, haunting quality to it, even if it was like intended for children.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really comes across in these, and it's really cool.
Yeah, the book, it's not like a story from what I remember. It's like a description of like, it was like a whole made up explanation of how dragons work. Like, how do dragons fly? So then it would do like diagrams of it. Or it's like, this is how a dragon's born. This is a dragon's egg. This is the size comparison of different types of dragons. So it was like one of those kind of books where it's explaining the made up lore to like a kid. So that kind of shit was definitely up my alley.
Oh yeah.
Sweet. All right, Chad, bring us home. Unless somebody else has something. Nope. Cool. I didn't know how to classify this. You just gave me some images, and I was like, all right, some other cool shit.
Well, the middle one is Noriyoshi Ohara, and this is all oil color. He painted in oil paint, but he did this like crazy. It's very Japanese illustration. So he did all the Godzilla posters, the Japanese Star
Oh, I
Wars
love
posters,
those.
all that. You can't find much on him unless you go to Japan. He has his own museum. He recently passed away, and you can't get his books here in the United States. Well, at least not for cheap. But just look at his stuff. It's amazing, so colorful, and it's all oil paintings. You wouldn't think it's oil paintings, but I don't know. I really love him. Check out his Godzilla posters.
Oh yeah, those are so cool. I know which ones you're talking about too.
Super colorful. And then the ones on the ends, that's Esteban Morado, and he's also a Spanish artist, but he painted and all that and did the cover. So he did like Wolf, Dracula, Drax, and you find a lot of it in the same eerie, creepy magazine. And I would say he's kind of like a groovy horror fantasy kind of, really psychedelic. Like his drawings are amazing. It's always covered with spider webs, and they're like cool spider webs, like circles and all, lots of bubbles, and it's really trippy fantasy stuff, like really psychedelic. And his
Blacklight
paintings
poster,
are okay.
kind of shit.
What's that?
Kind of like blacklight poster kind of stuff,
Yeah, most of his stuff's in black and white though. Like he does,
Oh yeah.
the panels, but it's so cool. It's like it's such a trip. It's really loosely drawn. There's like no shading. It's all line work, which is blacks, but tons of weird details, like little bubbles and circles, and all the women have like butterfly face paint, and it's really from the time. So
What was the
I'd
name
recommend
of
checking it out.
this artist, or like something to grab?
What's that?
What's the name of this artist, and then maybe something to like look up to buy?
Yeah, Esteban Morado.
Okay.
And then you can get I had all the books downstairs, but all these eerie and creepy, these collections from Dark Horse.
Yeah,
But
I have
he
one of
does
those.
like it's a lot of stories in those. It's called Drax. It's here. Let me see. Here's some. See his stuff. I don't know. You probably can't see it, but his stuff it's really loose.
Oh, that's cool.
You can't see it on here. It's really awesome. Lots of sparkles. Lots of trippy. And you see, he doesn't do shading at all. I'm trying to see where.
Yeah, he's still alive. He's 81.
Yeah. All these Spanish guys are still alive, I think, except for Pepe Gonzalez. And he did like drawing renderings of Vampirella.
Found
like that famous
Masters of
poster.
the Universe that he did.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Freaking He-Man and
It's super
She-Ra.
psychedelic.
How fucking
It's
yeah.
like
Wow. This is cool.
Barbarella or something, Yeah,
It's it has a very late 60s, early 70s vibe to it to me.
Yes. That's what I say. It's really groovy. He's
He
definitely
did
a
couple of
pothead.
these. There's a Skeletor one that he did.
Yeah.
It's sick.
Those
Very
are some
cool.
of his paintings. He's awesome.
Yeah.
Really loose.
Yeah, it's definitely my type of vibe. Tyler, Simon, you guys got anything on these?
Who was the one over here on the far right?
That's Esteban Morado.
Oh, also Esteban over there on the right. Well, okay,
Yeah.
cool.
That's it's like a vampire book called V, DIY.
Mhm.
And then he also did Dracula, but Dracula was a sword and sandals one. I don't know why it's called Dracula.
Yeah.
But he did Dracula books too. I don't know. He's probably out there. And he's still around. I think he's on Instagram.
I'd seen a lot of his black and white stuff, but it was mostly just in, somebody would post it on the internet and like credit him and stuff. And it's cool to see more of his stuff like in the context of how he actually, of where he was publishing and stuff, because it was, I've seen the name and I've seen enough of his stuff to like recognize his style, but to actually know like what he was doing and see like these like full page panels and stuff. That's really cool.
Yeah, always piles of skulls just in the corner of the drawing.
Yeah.
Nothing has anything to do with whatever's happening.
Yeah, I love this one on the left and just all of these like different elements.
Mhm.
And how it all kind of flows together in an almost like abstract composition, even though there's like, you know, everything's recognizable, but just
Yeah,
kind of
I
like
love it. Just
There's a couple of interesting there's a couple of interesting things where he's got like on this one on the far left, like the God, it's hard to point out, but the purple edge that kind of extends up from the Conan figure's like shield that goes up to this like weird cat thing. It's just like a line. It like doesn't. It's not indicating anything in the composition. You just like, I'm going to put a line that's just going to be an edge. That'll be the end of the purple bit. Like I kind of like when they do it. Just like here's just a line. It's like completely abstract, but it's a design element more than it is like an illustrative element. And that's really freaking cool.
I feel like it kind of it follows the line of her cloak, but then there's also like all of this other purple back there. Like her body just kind of turns into a purple background.
Yeah, well, there's this like weird cat guy. Like, I don't know. He's like, I don't know what he's doing back there. He's just back there. He's not part of the cloak. It's like it's kind of cool.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I like that. That's just there. Like whatever. It's like it's not. It's a really good decision. It just is not one you can justify on anything other than it looks good. You know what I mean? And that's great. Like that's awesome when people have like when an artist has the courage to do something like that, where someone might say that doesn't make sense. Well, it looks fucking cool. So, what are you talking about?
Oh, that's funny. Sweet. All right, guys. Well, landed pretty close on time. Appreciate everybody. You know, all you guys. I thought this was fun and definitely helpful. I always like pick up new things, new artists, new ways of looking at stuff. So, I want to thank everybody for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
guys.
Sweet. Well, for anybody,
it's nice to meet all you guys. I mean,
nice to meet you.
Yeah.
You know, I've been following each of you on Instagram. I've never had in person, so it's nice to finally see your face.
Yeah, definitely.
for sure. Well, for everybody watching, please check out everybody on Instagram. Lucas, Shoggoth Kinetics, Tyler, Creep from 6 Feet Deep, Chad Kieth. You're still going by Chad Kieth Helinski, right? Helsinki. All right.
Yeah.
And we got Simon Underwood, Lizardbrain Art on Instagram. And if you guys don't mind, like and subscribe to the channel. But yes, another panel down. Episodes every Thursday, if not more frequently.
Everybody just froze.
And Lucas is in freeze world here. It's all good. All right. But everybody, I'll see you guys next week for the people watching. And panelists, thank you again. I'm sure we'll all keep in touch. See you guys.
Thank you. Guys, have a good one.